Thank you very much, Michelle. Maybe that's a better title for the book, actually. Maybe that's book number 2. So, can I make you more creative in the next 10 minutes? It's not long, probably not quite long enough to transform you to be world-class musicians or artists. That would take at least 15 minutes, right? But what about problem solving? Can I make you a better problem solver in the next 10 minutes? Absolutely. You see, creativity is a skill, right? And like all skills, it improves with practice. And I think another thing that helps with our own creativity is to remind ourselves of how creative you already are. It's an embedded skill. Just pause for a moment and think how many problems you've solved, how vivid your imagination is. Now, when we come to develop your creativity, it also helps that creativity follows a process that you can develop at every stage. And this is how we're going to spend our time today. So to give you a bit of context, perhaps, my background, I used to be a musician. Psychology was my degree, but music was my passion, so that's what I pursued for most of my 20s. Until in 2007, I broke my ankle quite badly doing a handspring, and that prompted a pivot, and I retrained as a clinical hypnotherapist. We haven't got time for that either, I'm afraid. I set up my practice in London, where I've flown in from, and the more people I helped, the more frustrated I became, not with the clients or my patients, but the very fact that people needed to seek a specialist's help for things like sleep or stress. Why are we not taught this stuff at school? So that then prompted me to deconstruct what I'd learnt in order to teach it to other people so people wouldn't need to see a therapist anymore. And that's what's really triggered my interest in neuroscience. So now I work with businesses all over the world, and I help the leaders of these businesses apply what we know about the brain to improve their performance at work, of which creativity is a critical skill. So what have I learnt helping other people become more creative? Well, as I've said, creativity follows a process, and these are the 3 most reliable approaches to help people develop their creativity, and this is what we're going to do together. Number 1, reframing problems. What I mean about that is your capacity to challenge your assumptions, to ask better questions, which I think this is a stage we often overlook. So the first stage is about reframing the problem, and you do that through challenging your assumptions, through examining what you think you know. The next stage is probably more familiar: generating ideas, brainstorming, lateral thinking, divergent thinking. Most of the research, I would suggest, is focused on this aspect of creativity. We'll go there briefly. And then finally, what about having creative insights? A very different type of creativity, right? If you've ever had a good idea in the shower or on a walk, in your sleep. That's what I mean by creative insights. We're going to explore all 3. So, let's begin. Reframing problems. I think we all love creativity and problem solving so much that we tend to jump to the idea generation stage too quickly, right? We have a problem and suddenly, right, let's do a brainstorm. And it's a mistake. Because the first step has to be getting a greater understanding of what the problem actually is, and you do that through asking better questions. They enable you to reframe your problem. Einstein perhaps said it best. He said, if I had an hour to solve a problem, I would spend the first 55 minutes establishing or determining the proper question to ask. Maybe a story will illustrate this point. There's a hotel in New York, so the story goes, and they closed their doors for a number of months in order to do a vast refurb, right? They spent all of their money and they created something beautiful. So when they opened their doors, they reopened their doors, people came in, and it was stunning. But they started to get a lot of complaints. The lifts are too slow. So we spent all of our money, and the one demographic that we're trying to impress are now more upset than they were. The lifts are too slow. How do you solve the problem? Well, if you jump straight to a brainstorm, perhaps you come up with creative ideas to redirect people up the stairs or to change the floor structure. Maybe you can speed up the lifts. How did they solve the problem? They put mirrors everywhere. The complaints disappeared. Why? People don't mind waiting if they can look at themselves. Why is this an important story? The point is this. They didn't change the lifts. They didn't speed up the lifts. The problem was not the speed of the lifts. The problem was that people needed to wait. You ask better questions early on, suddenly the solution presents itself, often much cheaper than a brainstorm would have led you to believe. Right? So, how do you become more creative? You start by getting better at asking questions. Let's try this. Each one of you, I want to make this as valuable as possible, in which case, let's actually work through a problem. We've only got a few minutes, but think of a problem you'd like to solve. Something specific. A lot of people, it might be, how could I communicate something better? How could I influence better? How could I develop a particular skill? How could I improve a particular process? How could I balance work and life better? Now, you might want to solve all of those. Pick one. Hold it in your mind. Now, thinking about that problem, don't jump to solution orientation. Begin by asking better questions. So, thinking about that, now consider these questions. How do you know it's a problem? What would define success? How will you know if you've solved the problem? What would that enable you to do or feel or be? What's stopping you solve the problem? What would you do if you had unlimited resources? What advice might you give someone else with the same problem? What could you do to make the problem worse? You see, what these questions do is they enable a shift. They enable you to see the problem in a new light. They challenge your assumptions. They help you examine what you think you know. And this, I can't stress this enough, has to be the first stage when you're trying to solve problems. Defer your predisposition to try to solve it. First, get clarity on what you think the problem is. Certainly as a coach working with businesses, sometimes getting a team of 3, 4, 5 people, just doing this very exercise, just asking questions for 5 minutes, and it changes everything. Problems they've been working on for 6 months suddenly are seen in a new light. As a clinical practitioner, as an ex-hypnotherapist, then if I ever heard the words, I never thought about it like that, something powerful has happened. And you can do that, and you do it by asking questions. So, the next time you need to solve a problem, start with questions like these. Now, the next stage, generating ideas. This is when you do get to brainstorm, to engage in your natural lateral capacity to generate ideas, to involve divergent thinking. Now, again, a lot of the research is spent on this, so I'll actually counter that by spending the least amount of time here. But there are some insights that do make your brain more lateral, more divergent, and consequently better at generating ideas. The test we normally use to measure divergent thinking and consequently get an insight into people's creativity is called the alternate uses task. How many different ways can you think of to use a paperclip? Now, I'm not going to ask you to do this, but the very act of thinking about that will start to point you towards things that help you generate more ideas. You could just give it more time, right? Involve more people. Now, all those things are kind of intuitive. They make sense. But the thing that gets in our way is our inability to defer judgment. Even though we know that's the critical part of brainstorming and idea generation, we still judge our ideas. We're afraid to offer the silly ones where often they're the best ones. So if I were to break down the research or the tips into the key principles, it's number 1, defer judgment. That then enables you to go for quantity, which is what you're doing, not quality. That comes as a secondary gain from the quantity. If you want to increase quantity, well then sure, give it time, involve other people. But the technique or the trick that I think is most valuable for individuals and for teams is to get better at shifting your perspective or your perceptual position. What do I mean by that? Okay, the paperclip. How many different ways can you think of to use a paperclip? How would you use it when you were 5? How might you use it 30 years from now? What would you use it for if you found yourself stranded on a desert island? You see what all these things do? They shift your perspective to deliberately engage with the challenge through the eyes of someone else. Even if there's only one of you, you can engage in what other people would answer to this problem. Edward de Bono, I'm sure you know, his thinking hats do the very same thing. What would the problem look like if you were an optimist, if you were a pessimist? They engage in your what if, your counterfactual mindset. And this, again, is potent. It's so valuable. So again, how do you become more creative? Get better at shifting your perceptual position. Get better at pausing to see the problem through someone else's eyes. Not only will it help you develop your empathy, but it will make you more creative. It will help you generate more ideas. So, the brainstorm's done. Are we finished? Absolutely not. Because just as you can make the observation that when we think about decision-making, Alain de Botton said, the chief enemy of good decisions is a lack of sufficient perspectives on a problem. You might have that, but the real key, I believe, to becoming more creative, and I think the biggest challenge we have when we talk about improving creativity, is this final stage, the creative insight stage. And this, I think, is where your creative brain becomes so fascinating. And we refer back to those ideas in the shower. How many of you have had a good idea in the shower? Show up, hands up. Interesting. For others, maybe it's when you wake up, right? Or just as you're drifting off to sleep, suddenly you get clarity in a way that the day never really enabled or facilitated. For some people, it's when you go for a walk or you engage in some light exercise. Archimedes in the bath. What's that about? It's quite strange, isn't it? Because certainly if you think about, well, what could you do to become more creative? The observer would see very different behaviors. Are there similarities between getting in the bath, going for a walk, maybe getting a little bit drunk, and then falling asleep? Well, from a behavioral perspective, perhaps not. From your brain's perspective, absolutely. They all create a shift in your brain state. They shift what is commonly known as beta, brainwave frequency. They slow it down to alpha. And as scientists have studied the neural correlates of aha moments, these flashes that seemingly come from nowhere, what we observe is they tend to be preceded by an alpha brain wave. So, how do you become more creative? Sure, get better at reframing problems. It's a critical part of solving problems. Then get better at divergent thinking, absolutely. But the big message I really want you to take home is to get more from your creative brain, your naturally creative brain. It depends upon you letting your mind wander, giving your brain downtime. This is what you're trying to do. You're trying to shift your brain states down, and you know the things that do it. You have a break. You sleep on the problem. Get in the shower. Have a bath. Do some light exercise. Stop trying to solve the problem, and herein lies the paradox and the challenge. Some aspects of creativity, the more you try to solve the problem, the more you inhibit the answer. And with our bias towards activity and action, we forget that it's inactivity and mind-wandering and switching off, disconnecting, that is the one thing that enables this naturally creative association machine to thrive. So borrowing now from Tim Krieger, idleness is not just a vacation, an indulgence, or a vice. It is as indispensable to the brain as vitamin D is to the body. And herein lies the challenge. If we know that your creative brain depends on disconnection, a wandering mind that is non-directed, how much do we now allow for that to happen naturally? How many of you checked your phone before you got out of bed this morning? Hands up. Interesting decision. Knowing that so often our best ideas come as we wake up. How many of you would be on another device in the last 60 minutes at the end of today? Hands up. Despite already observing that previously in our life, that's been the window of insights. And then how many times, well, already do you think you've unlocked your phone today? The research suggests 100, 150. Firstly, what is that about? But critically and more relevantly, every time you're doing that, you're destroying what could have been a state that facilitated creative insight. So, like I said, let's wrap this up. I want to conclude by bringing it all. How do you become more creative? Number one, you remind yourself that you're already amazing at it. Then you break it down into a process. The more you develop each stage, the more creative you're likely to become. And critically, you get better at reframing problems. You do that through asking questions, challenging your assumptions, examining what you think you know. And then you get better at divergent thinking, generating ideas, and you do that best by deliberately shifting your perspective or your perceptual position. And then finally, give your brain more downtime. Allow your mind to wander. You do that, and my friends, believe me, your naturally creative brain will come alive. Thank you very much.